Hi, in today's video we're going to take a look at creating a changelog of your Git repositories. Now what I was doing was creating a list of Git repositories I'd changed on my main machine and I needed to pull down on other machines. So I'd create a simple list of the Git repositories that had changes in them, switch to another machine and then pull down those repositories. I wanted something a bit more useful. So what I did was I came up with this. This is the rendered version on GitHub. What we have here is to-do states. So what I can do is actually execute a to-do on a Git repository and mark it as being changed on a particular machine. We then have a noweb code block so that we can reuse the same code without having to type it out multiple times. And then what we have here is the status of the Git repository. We have the GitHub URL, we have the local path to the repository, and then the Git status. So what we have here is the Git hash, the Git commit message, the time and date, and then the status of the repository. So as you can see here, I have several repositories listed, my main code repository, my dot files here, root dot files, and so on for my other machines down here. But let's take a look how we do this in Emacs. So what we have here is a org file, and I've actually called it readme.org because when you upload a file to GitHub, I wanted the file to be displayed when the repository is opened. So for example, what I mean is, you can see here the repository is called changelog, but the file is called readme.org. And that way, when you go to the repository, the file shows up straight away without having to click something. So what we have here is, first of all, the startup show 2 levels. So that shows these 2 levels. Then what we have here is property, header args, sh results, output table, replace, noweb, yes, wrap, quote. So I'm going to go through all of those options. So what this does is this sets the default options for the code blocks. So when I execute a code block, it's going to create a results output in a table. It's going to use noweb, which I'll explain in a moment. And importantly, it's going to wrap the results in a quote. And that's vital because otherwise it won't be rendered by GitHub. So what I'll do is go through the options and show you how this works. I also have to-do states listed here. So what we can see here is XPS, and then in parentheses X, Air, A, Pro, P, and then synced. So this is a Dell XPS, a MacBook Air, and a MacBook Pro. And what this allows you to do is actually execute Control-C, Control-T on the GitHub repository, and then you'll be prompted through a little menu where you can type one of those letters, and it will then mark it as being changed on that machine. So let's have a look here. So the to-do states, when the cursors are on a header, we execute Control-C, Control-T, and then we can press one of these keys. X, the changes are only on the Dell XPS. A, the changes on the Air. P, the changes are on the Pro, or S synced, and space to clear. So now what I'm going to do is show you the noweb code block. And as you can see up at the top, what we have here is noweb yes. If not familiar with noweb, it's basically a way of having a block of code and then passing a variable into that block of code and having it referenced in another block so you don't have to type the same thing out over and over again. So what we have here is 2 lines, and I'll explain the first one in a second. The command that we're actually going to be running is git-c expanded path, and this actually corresponds to the path of the local Git repository. Now you might not know that you can actually execute Git commands when you're not actually in the Git repository. So typically what you would do is, if I come across here to a Git repository, Git Cerberus, Git log, okay, you can see that's showing me the log for this repository. But what you can actually also do, I'll switch back to the desktop, is if you run git with the -C option, give it the path to the repository and a command, it will actually execute that git command when you're not in the repository. And the reason why that's important is because what we want to do is we're basically executing git commands using Emacs org babel code blocks, and we don't want to have to keep changing into different directories. So what this code block does, let me come down here and actually show you this here. What we have here is a named code block called Cerberus. Then we have header var path equals and the path to the repository, and then the sh code block. And what you'll see down here is noweb block. Okay, so what we got here is two things. We have a variable called path that is equal to the GitHub, the Git repository path, and then this noweb code block. So when I run this bit of code by running Control-C, Control-C, what it's actually doing is it's taking this path variable and passing it into this noweb code block up here. So what you'll see is two sections, as I said. The first section here, expand path equals eval echo path. And what that's doing is the path here is the variable that we're passing into it. Okay, which is tilde/git Cerberus. Now the issue is with noweb code blocks is the code expansion. It doesn't actually expand the tilde to your home directory or using the home variable. So what we're doing is we're creating a variable called expanded path and running eval echo path. And what that does is that expands the tilde to the full path to your home directory. So then what we have is git-C and the expanded path. So that's going to be git-C and then the path to the Git repository. So what that means is we don't have to use the cd command in this code block. So we don't have to run cd into the Git repository to execute the git command. We can just pass in the -C option and the path to the repository. Then what we have here is log pretty format, and what we have here is the format option. So what we have here is the hash, then the commit message, which is S. Then we have CD, which is actually the time, and down here what we have in double quotes is %D, and what that is that's the Git status. So that's the status of head basically. Then what you'll see here is -10. So what this is doing is it's going to show just the last 10 commits. Then finally what we have here is the date format. So this is hours, minutes, seconds, day, month, year, and that is used with this -CD. Okay, so what happens is I come across here. When I execute Control-C, Control-C on this code block, what it's actually going to do is execute this noweb code block, pass in the path as I said, and run that command and output the results here. Now, the second really important thing is we have to wrap the results in a quote, because otherwise they aren't actually rendered on GitHub. They only show up in the raw version of the file. So what I'm going to do now is actually show you how this works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change to this Git repository and show you this in effect. So what I'm going to do is come into this repository dev echo test test.text. Okay, git add git commit test. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute this code block, and I haven't pushed the change to the Git repository as yet. So what I'm going to do is run Control C, and what you'll see is we have this test file here. So you can see here we have the latest commit, test, the time and the date, and what you'll see is we have head here, and then we have GitHub master, GitHub head. So what this is telling us is we've added a commit, but we haven't actually pushed it to the repository yet. What I'm going to do is actually delete this quote block again, so you can press tab here and delete it. And the reason why you need to do that is because even though we have the replace option set in the header, which normally replaces the contents of the results, because we have it wrapped in a code block, it would actually append another quote code block with the results in. So I'll delete that. Git push GitHub master, switch back. Now what you'll see is you can see head and GitHub master, GitHub head are all on one line, indicating that this is now being pushed to the GitHub repository. So what I can now do is, if I come up here, see I'm on this heading here for this Git repository, is I can run Control C, Control T, and you'll see here I'm prompted with this little menu down at the bottom showing X for XPS, A for Air, P for Pro, and S for Synced. So what I can do is press X, and you'll see it's now marked that XPS. So what that means is I know I have made changes to that Git repository on this machine, but it hasn't been pulled down to the other machines. So what I would do now is on the other machines, I would pull down the Git repository, and once I've done that, I'd run Control C, Control T, and then I'd change it to Air. Okay, so I know that's now been synced from XPS to Air. Do it again. Pro is now being synced there, and finally I can do Control C, S synced. And you'll see we have this closed thing here. What you can also do is, if you want to clear it, you can run Control C, Control T, press space, and that will clear everything out. So let's remove that file. So git rm test git commit move file. Now, as I said, if I come back here, I haven't pushed the changes yet. You'll see that the local head is only on this machine, but it hasn't been pushed to GitHub yet. So what I'm going to do is just delete that again. Git push GitHub master. Okay, so you can now see I've removed the file. So what I have here is the hash, the commit message, the time, the date, and we can see everything is now being synced up. So if I come back across here, refresh the page. Again, what we have here is just some notes, so remember how we execute the to-do state. This is the noweb code block that I was explaining. So basically, as I said, what the noweb code block allows us to do, instead of having this code here, repeated multiple times throughout this page, what we do is we just reference this this code block and pass in a variable. So what we have is the GitHub URL, the local Git repo. Now, another thing I want to mention is you can see here, I can select this, okay? And that is because we have, even though this isn't actually a shell command, okay? So you can see here we've got a begin source sh code block. If you have a example code block instead, you won't actually get this option to copy. You only get the option to copy the code when it's actually a code block. Then what we have here is the noweb block here, okay? And that corresponds to this section here. So we have three things here. We've got the name of the code block, the header, var path, and then the path to the repository. And that's why I have the path to the repository up here, so I can remember. And then finally, we have this noweb code block. And again, that corresponds to this up here. So as I was saying, we pass in the path, we create a variable that expands the tilde, otherwise it doesn't work. We use git with the -C option, which allows us to execute the git command without actually being in the Git repository, because otherwise what we'd have to do is in this code block, we'd have to have cd and then the path to the Git repository before we could run the command. So that makes things simpler. We then have the log here, as I explained. So what happens is when we're executing this code block, passes in the path to the noweb code block, and you can see up here, you can see this header args sh. So instead of having results output table replace noweb yes wrap quote appended to every code block that we're going to execute, we can set those as the default. So what happens is when we execute the code block, the results are output into a table, replace, we have noweb set yes, and wrap quote so that they're wrapped in a quote. And that's what we get here. So we have a nice table that's properly formatted, so we can easily see the hash, the commit message, the time and date, and the status of the repository. There isn't an easy way to actually add headers to this table. I couldn't figure out a way to do it natively with Emacs. There may be a way to actually sort of do it with something like awk or something like that, but what happened is when I tried that, it just messed up the table. So I think this is quite self-explanatory. If you're used to using Git, you should get the gist of what this is actually trying to do. So what I have here is other repositories. So I have my nixos.files, root files, and then Debian, which I'm running on my old MacBook Pro Retina 2015. And I'm using a 2011 MacBook Air, which is my really old machine running NixOS. So I've got three machines, Dell XPS, which is the machine I'm currently on, which is 2019 running NixOS. The old MacBook Air running NixOS, and then the MacBook Pro running Debian. So what this allows me to do is these are the repositories I'm going to change the most, and it allows me to basically keep track of what I've changed. So it's a much better way of doing it than the way I was doing it before here, where I'd simply, if I was making a change to some repositories on this machine that I'd need to pull down, I was just creating a list of the repositories I've changed, and then once I've synced them up to the other machines, I would just delete that, and I'd just have a changelog file on the desktop, and then, you know, whenever I'd make changes, I'd fill them in again. And it just didn't seem like a very efficient way of doing things. So that's why I came up with this solution. And as I said, the repository is called changelog, but the org file that I'm using is called readme. And again, that is so that when I come to this repository, the contents of the file are shown to me straight away, because otherwise, if it was called changelog.org, it wouldn't be rendered here. You'd have to click into the file before it actually be displayed. So as I said, what we've got is a little note on the to-do notes, no web code block, the repository. So I've got the, so I can easily come across here and see my repository. I know what the local path is, and I can see exactly which changes I've made to the repository. I can see here, Nix revert flake. So we've got nixos.files here. Root, NixOS MacBook, my bin directory for scripts. So, you know, I can see what's been changed there. Debian.files. So I can see exactly what commit messages I've made here, the hashes, time and date, and that everything is synced up. So it's just much more user-friendly way to actually keep track of your Git repository status. And as I said, what's particularly useful is if I track everything down, this is just showing spaces between here because I've actually made the file bigger. So typically it would look like this. I've just made the text bigger so that it's actually easier for you to see. So again, when I want to, the workflow is you make a change to the Git repository. When you've done that, what you do is you come in and you delete the quote. Okay, if I was to keep the quote there and run it again, it would just append another one. And that's just an issue of the results being wrapped in the quote block. And that's necessary because otherwise what happens is, where's the raw? Can I show you the raw thing? Raw, yeah, okay. Okay, here, raw. So this is the raw version of the readme.org file. And without the quote, what happens is this results block wouldn't actually be rendered on this page here as a table. Okay, I've tried wrapping the results in other blocks like org mode or sh or what have you, but none of them worked. Only quotes worked for some reason. So that's the reason for using the quote block, is so that we can have this rendered. There's different ways you can actually render the results output as a list or whatever, but for me, using a table was the right option because it's really nicely formatted here. We've got nice formatting from GitHub and with different colored rows here. So it makes it very easy to see the hash, the commit message, time and date. So we got the exact time, the date, and the status of the repository here. So it's just much nicer to actually go through. So as I said, the workflow is you change something in the Git repository, you come in, you delete the quote, Control C, like that. I can then mark the repository as having been changed on this machine by running Control C, Control T. And as I showed you, I can then press one of these keyboard shortcuts here, XAP P or S to actually change the status of which machine the changes have been made. Now, another thing to note is you will see that when I push the changes up to, if I mark that with XPS, and I'm using Magic here, so I run Control-XG. Oh, hang on, Control-XG. S for stage, C, and C again, commit message, change log, Control-C, Control-C, P, and then you can see I press U. Right, that's pushed up the changes. Now, if I refresh this, what you will notice is if I come across to this heading here, Cerberus, you'll see that the to-do state here, XPS, this text here isn't actually rendered, and I haven't figured out a way to get that to work. That may just be something that's not possible, but the main thing is I have the status shown here, so that when if I just collapse this, when I come through here, I can actually see, okay, I've made changes on this machine to this repository, and I then need to push them to the other one. So again, when I want to pull down those changes, I pull the change down on the other machine. On this file, I run Control-C, Control-T, change it to Air, change it to Pro, and then I can either press synced or I can just clear it with space like that. Change log. And that way I have a sort of Emacs dashboard showing me all the status of my Git repositories, the commit messages here and everything with the to-do state, and I can push them up to GitHub and actually have it rendered like this, where I have a nice table showing the hash, commit message, time, date, the status. And remember, if you've made changes locally and not pushed them up, you'll see that head will be on a different line. So that's another benefit. And the reason, another thing I should mention is you need to keep this changelog file separate from your Git repository. So you can't use this in the actual Git repository. And the reason for that is because after you've made changes to the Git repository, you need to execute this code block to output the results in the table, yeah, which you would then have to commit. So the issue is if you have this file in the actual Git repository and you'd made changes to the Git repository and pushed them up, you would then have to execute the code block to show that everything headed all on one line, and then make another commit and push that up. So you'd have to do two commits, which doesn't make sense. So that's why the changelog is its own separate repository, because otherwise you would run into that issue. So I think this is an improvement on what I was doing before, where I just had a list of the Git repositories that I've changed, and I had no way of showing what commit messages were, or the hash, or the date and time, or which repository had been synced to which machine. So using this is a sort of big improvement. So let me just bring that down to normal level. So just to recap, what we have, show two levels. So that automatically shows the 2-level heading deep here. So I've got Cerberus, I've got NixOS, and then these ones down here, and then Debian. The property header args sh results output table replace noweb yes wrap quote. That is so that we have those globally set rather than having those appended to each of these source code blocks. Yeah. Then we have the to-do states listed. So again, what you want to do is actually, if you don't have this sort of brackets X, A, or whatever you're going to use, when you run Control C, Control T, what it will do is just actually cycle through them. So by having these options set here, what it means is when you add a to-do state, you get that little pop-up menu at the bottom where you can press the keyboard shortcut. And again, the noweb code block, you can see here we've got noweb block, and that corresponds to this noweb block here. So what, again, that means is rather than having this exact line of code here repeated multiple times through the document, we can just reference this noweb code block, pass in the path variable from the header. Yeah, so you see the header var path. We pass in the path, and remember we have to create another variable called expanded path, run eval echo path to expand the tilde, otherwise it doesn't work. Then we're running the git with the dash capital C option so that we can run the git command without actually having to be in the directory. The expanded path to the repository, log, the pretty formats, we've got the hash, the commit message, the time and date, and we need to have this one in double quotes, which is the head status, because otherwise it actually messes up the formatting. It doesn't actually show up all in this block here without the double quotes. And finally, we got the -10 to show just the 10 latest commit messages and the date format. And so basically, we have a nice short bit of code block here, and all we have to do is actually change the path. So if I come through, and when you want to collapse the code block, what you do is just come onto quotes, press tab, and so if I come in here, what you'll see is we've got the exactly same format for the NixOS doc files, GitHub URL, local path, and then you can see here we have the name, and the reason why you have the name is because so that it actually outputs the name for the results here. Otherwise, it can get confused and sort of try and append it to a different one. So we have a nice setup here. Just name, the variable path, the URL, the path to the Git repository, and then just no web block. So really nice short bit of code. And then when we execute this code block, it's going to output the results down here. Results NixOS doc files, begin quote. And again, when you make changes, what you want to do is actually delete the quote, run Control C again here to output the results again. You can then mark this as Control C, Control T. You get a nice little pop-up here where you just press a key to indicate which machine the changes have been made on. See here, space to clear. And then finally, just push the changes up to GitHub, and you've got a nice little changelog showing the status of all your Git repositories. There were a few things that I needed to actually figure out along the way to get this working. The two main stumbling blocks were the expansion of the tilde in the noweb block using eval echo and then path, and the second one, which was a real bugger to actually figure out, was how to actually get the results rendered on GitHub. Because as I said, without you can see here without begin quote, end quote, if you just have results and this code, it doesn't actually get rendered on the page, which is really irritating, kind of defeats the whole object of the thing if you can't actually see the results on the page. So once I've got those two things figured out, it was all good. And I can zoom that back out to the regular size. And it just makes it easy for me to keep a list of the changes of all my Git repositories in one place. I can see all the commit messages, the hashes, the time and date, status. So rather than going to each of the repositories separately to see what changes have been made, I've got them all in one place. But as I said, you do need to keep this file separate from the actual Git repositories because, as I said, it's just the way it works. You have to make changes in the Git repository. You execute the code block which outputs the results, and then you have to push that up. So if you want to pinch this, feel free, and all you need to do is you can change the to-do listings here and keep the noweb code block. Just use one of these as an example. So just change the URL, change the path to your Git repository here, put in the path for your Git repository, and off you go. So hopefully you find that useful. And it's just an interesting way of using Emacs and org source Babel blocks to output the results, and also use noweb to simplify the amount of code in conjunction with setting the properties here. So we've reduced a lot of redundancy by not having to repeat this code on every block and not having to use this block of this line of code as well multiple times. So that's important because it leads to less errors and a cleaner file. So that's all for now, and I'll put links to this under the video.